Hello and welcome to the Growing Healthy Families podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Scott Haggerty. On this show, I interview the world's top health experts so that you can know with certainty what it takes to give your family a life of epic health and wellness.
As parents, we don't want to see our kids struggle. I knew that he had the potential, and I knew that something needed to be done.
It was hard. We would get frustrated. We didn't know how to deal with it. I was more emotional about it.
Sure that, we're here. Amen to that, brother. Amen to that. Of the Growing Healthy Families podcast. So, moms and dads, in this episode, I really want to talk about something that's extremely pertinent to what so many kids are dealing with today. As we dig into this topic, we're going to talk about a really big animal. We're going to talk about what is going on inside of our kids' brains. And in an earlier podcast, I interviewed a gentleman by the name of Dr. Robert Melillo, the author of the books Disconnected Kids, Reconnected Kids, Autism, and the Disconnected Kids Nutrition Plan. He is also the founder of the Brain Balance Achievement Centers. And in that episode, we talked about these concept of brain imbalances. But one of the things that I think is really important is that, we see our kids every day. And if you're never given context for what the brain is supposed to do, then it's really difficult for us to understand when the brain is not doing what it's supposed to do. So in this episode, what we're going to do is we're going to dig in and we're going to talk more specifically about how the brain is built to work so that we have a context. And then so we understand what's happening with the brain when it's not working as it should, or as we can say, getting out of sync. So I'm going to pull up here a slide presentation here. We're going to dig into this. Excuse me. And as we go through, I will try to really break this down in some detail. So if you have a pen and paper handy when you're listening to this, this could be very, very helpful. It can give you a greater understanding of what's going on inside your child's brain. So I'm going to pull up the slideshow and we're going to go ahead and get started. So hopefully you can see this. And so title here, very simple. Your child's brain connected versus disconnected. And so as we start talking about this topic, I want to pare this down quite a bit, right? Because for those of you who aren't familiar, in my practice here, my practice is a pediatric and family practice, but with a lot of our emphasis. We work very heavily with kids with neurodevelopmental disorders, ranging from ADHD, ADD, sensory processing, kids with autism, speech delays. And so when we talk about the brain, it's really important that we understand and that we own what the brain does. Because in our practice, we're looking every single time that we meet a new child, or an adult, as for that matter, because we care for a lot of adults as well. But we're looking for where do we see things that are signs that there are imbalances. And so let's talk about some really important pieces to start. We know that expression-wise, right, neurodevelopmental challenges really have kind of two pieces that we see. There are learned behaviors and there are what are called reflexive behaviors. And let me elaborate on that for a moment. So as we develop, we all learn how to respond to situations. Okay. But more importantly than how our learned responses work is how our reflexive responses work. And what that means in all actuality is that our nervous system's first job before all things is to perceive the environment, perceive the things happening around us, and then make a decision about how we respond to whatever the stimulus is, whatever the situation is. And so the reflex is, if we perceive things normally, then we have an appropriate output or response behavior, right? Like somebody comes over and says, "Hey, buddy, can I borrow your pen?" The normal response would be, "Oh, yeah, sure, no problem. Here, no big deal," right? Versus a child or an adult who they're living in a constant state of stress, well, that response might be like, "No, why are you going to borrow my pen? What the heck?" And they get upset over nothing, inappropriately, when they shouldn't have. And so we want to understand this really critical concept, because I had several conversations today with moms who are getting kids started into care. And one of the things I talk about often in these conversations is this concept of teapots. Let me explain. So if you're listening to this, I just want you to stop for a moment. I want you to visualize. Imagine that you have two teapots, exact same size, filled with the exact same amount of water all the way to the top. You put both of the teapots onto the stove at the same time, and you turn the heat up on teapot 1 all the way to level 8. Teapot 2, you turn up to level 2. So when you think about those, right, they're both being affected by heat. One's at a higher temperature, level 8, right? One's at level 2. So if you're looking at these, which of the two teapots is going to boil first? Well, naturally, the teapot that's at level 8, right? Because it's hotter, there's more energy going in, so it's more likely to boil first. So if we think about the way that the other one is, right, teapot 2, it likely won't even boil at level 2. And if it does, it will take an extremely long time to get enough heat into it that it'll actually steam. Now, what I want you to realize is that all of our nervous systems are actually built to be very similar to this. And let me elaborate for this. So you think about the way that we go through our day, right? If we have a situation that presents to us, we should be able to be kind of like teapot 2, right? We perceive something that's a stressful situation. Instead of flying instantly off the handle, we should be able to think our way through it, decide what's an appropriate response, decide to handle it long before we get upset about the situation, right? Lots of room, lots of slack in the system, slow to boil, okay? Where a lot of our kids live when they get to a place where they've got neurodevelopmental challenges, and it doesn't have to be anger, it can be temperament, it can be focus and attention, it can be sensory, stimming, all of those things. If their nervous system is at a place where it can't handle much more input, much more stimulus, or the nervous system is at a place where it's stuck so high on the fight or flight mode, then when they hit a little bit of stimulus, there's not much room. All of a sudden, if it's a kid with a temperament issue, they explode. If it's a kid who has difficulty with focus and attention, and they have to sit for a few minutes, all of a sudden they're fidgety and they're agitated and they're emotional and they can't sit still and they can't focus because they're not getting enough stimulus to calm their nervous system. It's a kid with sensory issues, right? Instead of being able to go into a situation like a crowded room, they may go in and just the sounds within a matter of minutes overwhelms them. They get upset and they have to disconnect and they have to leave. Or they put on a shirt that normally they shouldn't have any issues with, something that you and I wouldn't, and within a matter of minutes, it's driving them crazy so much so they want to tear it off. It's these inappropriate responses because the brain doesn't have enough slack, enough ability to handle it, so in turn it gets stressed and a stress output happens, a reflexive response. Oftentimes it will supersede an appropriate learned response. And moms and dads, if you're listening to this, you probably have a child who's had a meltdown and said, I don't know why I did that. I know what I should have done, but I just couldn't do it, right? Or a child who says, Mommy, Daddy, I don't want it to bother me, but it just doesn't. I don't know why. And it's totally involuntary. They know what to do, but they just can't do it because there's something in them that is so irritated or so sensitized, is the word that we like to use, that there's no slack in their system. Because instead of being at level 2, they maybe sit at level 6, level 7, level 8, and just a little bit sends them over the edge and they boil. So when we talk about how we help the kids in our practice, our ultimate goal is to always take them from level 6, 7, 8, wherever they're at, down to 2. But you have to understand there are effects to the way that the brain works, so that when we know what optimum looks like, we as moms and dads can start looking at the situation and say, I know what it's supposed to look like. So when it doesn't, then you start having a picture of, okay, maybe something is actually really and truly a problem. Because I know a lot of, moms and dads, I know a lot of you are like, okay, is this a normal behavior or is this not a normal behavior? And then you start looking for help and you start looking for resources and you go and see doctors. And so let me give you context. We know some very, very, very important details about brain function. So we know very specifically that the brain has prescribed functions. The right brain has very specific duties. The left brain has very specific duties. And what I'm going to do here is we're going to lay them out for you. So this is where that pen and pencil becomes really handy, okay? Because I'm going to go into detail as to what this looks like with you. So as we move forward, it is really important that we have a context of, I'm going to talk about when it looks the way it should, when the brain develops the way it should, and when we see that things are giving us indications that, maybe this just isn't quite right. Let's go ahead and move on. So here, let's start talking about what this looks like in terms of how the brain is built to respond. Oh, I think I hit my light here. So moms and dads, let's talk about what is going on inside the right brain. So when we talk about the right brain, we have to talk about some very important functions of it. So the right brain is really what we consider to be the social brain, okay? When we look at how it's built, how it works, the right brain is the part of the brain that sees the big picture, the worldview. It sees the whole, but not the parts, right? We talk about it seeing the forest for the trees. It moves the large muscles of the body. It is really intimately involved in things like our posture and our gait. It really is involved in things like our spatial awareness. And that's a really important concept, because when we talk about spatial awareness, we're talking about things like when someone says a child's clumsy, right? And they're having issues with balance and coordination. Oftentimes, it's not something that they control. It's their body awareness is off. It's distorted. It's not working the way that it's supposed to. And so that's a really critical concept. Balance and coordination are so intimately tied into this next concept called proprioception that spatial awareness, balance, coordination all depend upon proprioceptive input. And so proprioception, if you've never heard this term before, it's a really important concept because, if you've ever been to an occupational therapist, they do proprioceptive exercises to help to try and improve your child's brain function. And so this proprioception system is one that it is the refiner of all of the other senses. At rest, our brain is utilizing the nerves that lie in the joints, the extremities, and the spine, so that 90% of the brain's attention at any time is devoted to that one sense, because it's so critical at organizing all of the others. Your extremities have about 40% of those nerves, but your spine has about 60% of those nerves, which means that it's extremely dense. And then the area just beneath the skull, right here, between the base of the skull and the first and second vertebra, has 33% of that 60%. Now, think about that in terms of importance. Anytime that any area has a large density of anything, it's important. When you talk about the nervous system, because of the density of those nerves, it is critically, extremely important that those nerves work and fire as they're supposed to. Because if they don't, what ends up happening is when we lose proprioception, we get this opponent sense called nociception that actually creates noise, causes some disconnection in the brain, prevents the right brain and the left brain from developing symmetrically, and it triggers a stress response. So it has multiple different effects on optimum development. So this is why we have to have a very, very important understanding of proprioception. That's why if you go into an OT's office, they do proprioceptive and sensory integration exercises, but they do it through movement-based, right? They do it through, things where they're trying to stimulate proprioception. They're doing things where they're trying to specifically activate pathways that go up the spinal column to the brain, because you have to get those pathways to light up to bring the brain back into balance. We also look at things like nonverbal communication. It's the foundation for our social skills that live on that side. Our nonverbal feeds verbal development, which is a left brain function. It controls emotional intelligence. Our sensory controls, right, external and internal sensations all live in the right brain. Our sense of smell and our sense of taste live there. It's where we receive all auditory information, right? Receptive speech. It's where we get our sense of self, our self-awareness, our self-protection and avoidance behaviors live there. So our left brain is our curious brain. Our right brain gives the left brain permission or stops us. Important concept. It's a conversation between the right brain and the left brain. When they're in sync, the conversation is one where the right brain and the left brain, they allow each other to do certain things. If there is a disconnection, we do not see the appropriate responses in saying, protect yourself. I shouldn't do that. We don't have appropriate what they call inhibition. We also see the right brain is where we learn about negative emotions such as fear, anger, and disgust. It controls our attention and our impulses. So if you have a child that has issues with focus and attention, you have to know that one of the bigger issues is that is likely going to be a strongly associated right brain, left brain deficit, imbalance. We'll talk about that more here in a few minutes. And impulse control also lives there as well. So if you have a child that has difficulty with impulse control, this is hopefully giving you some context as to why. It also is where we learn things about socially appropriate behaviors. And one of the things I hear from a lot of moms and dads is that my child just does not seem to get social norms. Right there. If the right brain is not doing what it's supposed to, if it's not in balance with the left brain, if it's not as developed as it should be, we're going to have a difficult time understanding socially appropriate behaviors. The right brain also likes new and novel situations and locations, does not like repetitive tasks. It also is intimately involved in control of the immune system. Here's a really big piece of this. Because of its control of the immune system, it can inhibit it, keep it from overreacting. It also prevents antibody production against us, also known as autoimmunity. We see a lot of kids these days that are developing autoimmune conditions, right? A lot of kids who are really, really struggling with immune control. If the immune system is not working the way that it's supposed to, the right brain is the controller of the immune system. This is a big, big piece of the equation. And so if you have a child that has other different types of neurodevelopmental challenges, they most likely also have immune challenges because of right brain deficits or left brain imbalances. The right brain also controls most parasympathetic functions. And this is a big topic, right? Like if you've ever heard of the parasympathetic nervous system, that's rest, digest, growth, development, healing, heartbeat, motility, endocrine production, brain development, all of the things that make us grow, develop, and become healthy individuals live on the right side of the brain. So when we see that there's deficits, now we start having to put the pieces together as to what does that actually look like. Well, here's a profile, right? And we talk about this from the perspective of common things that we see in kids that have right brain deficits. And, moms and dads, listen, it can start as early as in utero. And if you've never heard this concept before, we want to understand that there are very specific things that we know about the way that the brain works. And so when we see right brain deficits, they can be in utero. If mom's nervous system was stressed out, mom's nervous system can create stress in baby's nervous system that prevents brain balance and proper brain development in the cortex. So stress in utero is a really big thing. And I've done other videos about that, and other podcasts about that with some of the other doctors that we've interviewed and some of the things I've done by myself. But you have to understand that this critical developmental window in utero, if the mom is constantly on stress mode, mom creates stress in the baby from the production of her stress hormones, cortisol, adrenaline, noradrenaline, amongst others. So here is what right brain deficits look like. Okay. Typically, the baby moved a ton in utero. Oftentimes, there was a very long labor and delivery. Sometimes what you'll see is that there will be a delivery after due date. Typically, there are issues with breastfeeding, colic, often very fussy, and you struggle to get them to sleep. They can be quick learners and oftentimes will read very early. They may have an amazing memory. Oftentimes, as a toddler, they ran you ragged. They typically tend to be very curious. Oftentimes, they spoke late, if at all. In school, early on, the teacher saw very specific behaviors. They started to act out, melting down, obstinance, impulsiveness, became disruptive, showed signs of oppositional behaviors. They began to have struggles with reading comprehension, struggles with higher level math. They struggled to make friends. Oftentimes, they would be the kid who invades other people's personal space. In school early on, teachers oftentimes said that the kids would say inappropriate things at times, especially at inappropriate times. Other kids sometimes may unfortunately think they're weird. And, moms and dads, I hear that a lot, right? Like, when a child is exhibiting a lot of these things, oftentimes one of the things they struggle with is friends. They're the kid who does the wrong thing at the wrong time, and in turn, their friends are like, he's a weirdo, and they don't like them or they don't include them, and their kid comes home and they're always upset because they're having a hard time getting friends, or they're having a hard time keeping friends because they can't seem to do the right thing at the right time. And they, Some people call it self-sabotage, and in a way it is, right? But it's not their fault because they don't understand what the socially appropriate thing to do is. So in turn, they do the inappropriate thing at the worst time possible. As they get older, they tend to have a lot of issues with frustration. And here's a couple of reasons. They oftentimes are far more intelligent than their peers. As the frustration and the fearfulness increases, you tend to see some oppositional behaviors develop in the kids. It's also very common that they will have sensory challenges. We talked about some of that, but that's a wide variety of things. So things like hyperacusis, sensitivity to sounds, like things like fireworks will drive them batty. They'll, tell people who are speaking to them, they're yelling at them, have a difficult time with loud noises and sudden noises, really, really get quite irritated from those things. Oftentimes, they'll have volume control problems. Things can be either, sometimes it's either too sensitive or they're too muted, where they may have a difficult time hearing sounds at all. They can be extremely picky eaters. Oftentimes, they seem kind of disconnected from others. The kid who is oftentimes more content to go and spend time on their own. We'll tie this together because there's other pieces that go with this disconnection piece. But oftentimes they will have a hard time connecting, period. Oftentimes you'll see their voice can be very monotone. So you oftentimes see that they didn't exhibit a lot of emotion. And moms and dads, if you're starting to put pieces of this together, right, when you start moving past all of the signs, the early deficits, then you start moving into when they start becoming problematic, where it's affecting quality of life and they're having a hard time going through and functioning as they should. Then we start looking at potential diagnoses. And listen, here's a list of the common diagnoses that are associated with right brain deficits. We tend to see ADD. We tend to see ADHD. We tend to see diagnoses of Asperger's, autism, Tourette's, OCD, oppositional defiant disorder, nonverbal learning disorder, pervasive developmental disorder, conduct disorders. These are super, super common right brain diagnoses. So moms and dads, when you start really looking at this stuff, I hope this makes sense as to why we see a lot of these types of diagnoses coupled with the things we talked about before with these deficits. But, when we talk about that, then we have to understand that because right brain and left brain have specific jobs, what does the left brain do? Because the right brain controlled a lot, but the left brain, because of its job, it also has a tremendous influence on development. And it's the opposite, right? The left brain is very much the part that sees the small picture, right? It's the trees for the forest. It's the brain that sees the details. It's not big picture oriented. It's I'm in the trenches, do the detail type work stuff. It zeroes in on breaking things apart, examines things and makes them into small pieces. Physically, it controls the small muscles, fine motor control. It controls hands, fingers, feet, toes, things like, tying your shoes, playing the piano, all come from that kind of small muscle control. It controls the small muscles of the throat and mouth. And this is really critical because now you're talking about speech development and enunciation. It's translating different sounds of letters and syllables into language. So now you're starting to see that the language centers really live on the left side of the brain. It's where we regulate our verbal skills. It's all language resides left side. All things relating to language. It's our expressive and receptive speech. Get it in from the right side, process it on the left side. Has to be sent across and has to be done in sync. Reading, writing, speaking, and interpretation all live left side. It allows us to read individual words and translate their meanings letter by letter, syllable by syllable. Left brain is very much the literal brain. It understands one primary meaning of a word. It is the conscious side of the brain. It controls all conscious movements, all conscious thoughts. When we talk about a child's self-talk or an adult self-talk, this is where this lives. It's all of the things that we say to ourselves. When we talk about things like school, right, it's our linear logical brain for studying. We control basic math operations here with this part of the brain. It's arithmetic, it's calculating, remembering numbers and sequences, pattern recognition skills, doing things like learning a brand new language, which makes sense, language side of the brain. It's mastering computer games. It's systematizing. It's our thinking brain. Left side of the brain absolutely loves routines. It's a very, very curious part. It's a very curious brain. Seeking and goal-directed behavior lives in the left side of the brain. When we measure intelligence, it is measured through what we can control through the left side of the brain. This side of the brain is better measured on IQ tests than anything else. When we look at the left side of the brain too, we also talk about things like approach behaviors. It is where we determine how we approach a situation, how we have developed our study skills, how we pick out patterns. There's a number of different things that go within this side. Left side of the brain is also our emotional brain. It's in charge of our positive emotions, things like happiness, having fun. It controls our motivation, controls anger. With the left side of the brain, obstacles here can lead to frustration and anger. When in balance, it controls our reactions in the face of adversity. When it's out of balance, opposite direction, overreaction. Left side of the brain hears high frequency sounds. It visually processes highly detailed input. It controls all immune regulation. It helps us to fight off infections and toxins by detecting them. It stimulates growth and development of immune and lymph tissue. This is where like white blood cells and other immune cells, where their regulation comes from. Because one thing, if you're not aware of this, right, the immune system is directly controlled by the nervous system, which makes it the neuroimmune system. It's been a big topic of conversation over the course of the last several years because they did discover that the immune system is directly 100% controlled by the nervous system. It activates and mobilizes our immune system to fight off infections. So anytime we get an infection, when this dude works the way that it's supposed to, left brain says, oh, there's an infection, sends in the troops, and we get past it. It also helps in autonomic function, right? And one of the bigger things that it does is it helps in regulating things like heart rhythm, which is a huge deal because there's a nerve called the vagus nerve, which is the primary control the body uses, which comes off the brainstem right about here. And it will decelerate the heart, lower the blood pressure, and a number of different things via the vagus nerve, because the vagus nerve is the most important nerve in all the body. It's what the brain uses to regulate every cell, tissue, and organ for maintenance. That's lungs, stomach, small intestine, large intestine, pancreas, liver, gallbladder, adrenal glands. All of those things are directly regulated via the vagus. So it's a huge controller for things that we need to optimize our function. Now, when we start talking about when the left brain begins to get out of rhythm, we need to understand what that looks like. Because now if we understand what it looks like when it's supposed to work, when it gets out of rhythm, there's also very predictable things that we start to see. We see things like symptoms that they kind of hide, right? Many of these things will hide until a child gets into school. What they start becoming is shy and withdrawn. You tend to see all of a sudden that they have low motivation and drive. Oftentimes, especially when it comes to kind of day-to-day life, they'll prefer to stay at home and not go out and play with the other kids. Oftentimes, you can see them being sullen and sad. When we tend to see issues with depression, it's often because the left brain is not working at capacity. It's out of sync with the right brain. Oftentimes, these kids, because of its control of speech development, they tend to start speaking very late. Oftentimes, they will mess up sentences when speaking. Oftentimes, can be very difficult to understand. May have very poor verbal skills and may not talk a lot at all. They tend to have a lot of issues with reading and spelling. They tend to have difficulty processing words and sounds. May not be able to carry a tune, right? You've ever heard, people who are called tone deaf, right? It comes from this left brain deficit. They tend to have issues with basic math, tend to be poor with details, and tend to have a lot of issues with bad handwriting, fine motor skills, things of that sort. Oftentimes, they tend to be very concerned with their physical appearance and what others think of them. They can be very emotional. Now, positively, it also gives them oftentimes a very high emotional intelligence, high emotional IQ. So it can, in some instances, be a bit of a strength. They tend to very much be people pleasers, but they can be oftentimes overwhelmed with feelings of guilt and shame for absolutely no reason at all. Now, when we talk about what this can lead to, right, it's oftentimes commonly associated with girls who tend to become depressed, cutters, things along that lines, because, the feelings of guilt can oftentimes overwhelm them. Now, they oftentimes can have high intuition. They can have unique abilities to read people and situations. They can be extremely social if they're able to overcome their shyness and their insecurities. Oftentimes, kids with these left brain imbalances tend to be exceptionally good athletes. Oftentimes, because they're so social, they're very well liked by others. They tend to have a lot of issues with infections, a lot of recurrent infections. And if you have a child who has recurrent ear infections, always seems like they're sick, having a hard time kicking it, this is a real common sign with these right brain deficits or left brain deficits. So when we start looking at what that looks like with diagnoses, we tend to find that all of this stuff tends to start falling into a bucket of things where the diagnoses that come with it are things like dyslexia. We tend to see diagnoses like eating disorders, auditory processing disorders, sensory processing disorders, so like dyspraxia. We tend to see things like dysgraphia, which is poor handwriting, learning disabilities, language disorders, reading disorders, acalculia, which is problems with calculating skills, oftentimes even things like selective mutism. So there tends to be a number of different issues that comes with this. There tends to be things like, a lot of academic problems, frequently ill, chronic ear infections, a lot of issues with like hearing and speech development, can see some real problems. They tend to be kids who, when you look at them, they tend to love the physical activities because they need it. They need the motion to calm themselves down. They like to climb and ride and skateboard and tend to have exceptionally good balance, but they, shy away from dancing teams and sports teams due to issues with timing, rhythm, and understanding of the rules because they can't put it together. These things tend to really become big life impactors for them. Especially like when they get in school, you tend to see that they oftentimes will struggle immediately because they're having difficulty with learning. They have difficulty with memory processing. It can really affect their ability to read and put things together because they're struggling to do things like sounding out words. They tend to have real difficulty with retention. They might be the kid who's loved by the teacher and well-behaved, but, they become, as they get older, really frustrated and disinterested in school because they feel like they just can't put it all together. And, they tend to hate sitting still. They get really, really fidgety. And, oftentimes what it'll start to do is it tends to affect their motivation. And then you start hearing things from like, I don't want to. I don't feel like it. And, around fourth grade is really where we start seeing a lot of the expressions of the bigger problems with these left brain challenges because they really get frustrated. You might hear them saying, I'm stupid. I'm dumb. You start really seeing them get very, very down on themselves because they also now are becoming acutely aware of what others think of them. And that's a huge challenge. And oftentimes around this age too is when you start seeing things like anger and defiance. Oftentimes these sudden behavioral changes can be very shocking to you moms and dads because they happen, almost out of nowhere when they make the switch. And oftentimes what happens is that's about the time that you're going to start looking towards, getting in touch with a psychologist or a psychiatrist because you're like, I just don't know what to do. We do all the right things. We're raising them the right way. We've done everything that we possibly can. And then you're hitting walls and you don't know what to do. When the right brain and left brain are talking as they should, the brain can develop these strong dominances or imbalances. And when they start living like this, these progressive quality of life changes, they become bigger and bigger impactors on their life. So, moms and dads, if you have a child that is struggling, I hope this gives you context. Now, it's not solution yet, right? Like there's a lot more that we need to dig into, and I'll get there. But that's a whole nother video, and I wanted to give you a framework so that if you think that maybe something is going on, you can start putting it together to start looking at, okay, so if I see these things, then they can be signs that potentially there's some imbalances. Now, I want to give you context, because oftentimes we look at this and we're like, well, my child has both. That's okay. The brain never is, let me don't say never. Rarely is the brain ever fully one side imbalanced versus another. There can be signs of both. And in some cases, that is what's happening. When we look at this, the goal is to give us bigger picture, because to help a child that has either a right brain imbalance or a left brain imbalance, what you're dealing with is the brain's out of sync. It's like having the right brain playing like hard rock, like Metallica, and the left brain is playing country music. Together, they make noise, and you don't get anything accomplished because you've got two competing things going at the same time, and the brain can't sort it out and figure it out. And so the conversations that the brain should be having back and forth of personality development and social development and regulation of self and all of the little things that we talked about here today, if they can't happen because the brain just can't slow down to put it together, or they're out of sync, then when we start looking forward, we have to start looking at, okay, so if we know these imbalances exist, even minor imbalances, then how do we help to change the situation so we can get the child's brain back into balance, and understanding what that actually looks like, and understanding how do we help our kids. So in the next video, what we're going to dig into is, how do we do that? What are the things that we can do to really help our child so that they can get on track for the quality of life that they need? And I'll go through a number of different strategies in that video so that what we talked about here, now you can start looking for what are the best avenues to proceed so that your child can get the help that they need, so you can help to get their brain back on track. And moms and dads, many of you may be at different points in your journey, right? Some of you have already gone down the road of putting your kids on meds. Many of you may have done nutrition. Many of you may have done OT or PT or neurofeedback. We'll start positioning things where they belong, okay? Because, with what we do, right? And you can see on here, right? I'm a chiropractor. I have a different perspective, because where we live at the place where the nervous system is, I'm one of the world's top experts on the nervous system, especially as it relates to neurodevelopmental disorders. I know more about this than most people because I have the benefit of knowing what the others do, understanding the brain at a very intimate level, understanding how the brain reconnects and what it takes to get the brain there, so that we can move things to a place where we can make a decision algorithm on what's best to make sure the child gets what they need to fully connect, okay? So as we get into the next video, I'll start putting things in place so that you'll get the data, you'll get the information, you'll get what you need, so that you know, where do I look first? What do I expect to have happen? What do I need to do to get the best results from this? Because the ultimate thing is that when you start really looking to help your child, you want to put all of the pieces together in the right way so that whatever you do gets the best result and your child's quality of life steadily gets better. But moms and dads, I will tell you, in all of these cases, the one thing that I want each one of you to start thinking is, most of these things didn't get there overnight. All of these things are a process. It's going to require time, it's going to require effort, it's going to require work, whatever you decide to do. But if you stay consistent, if you are persistent in what you do, and you're always, right, whether it's you're getting OT, you're getting PT, you're getting chiro, whatever it might be, consistency is key, consistency is king. Because the brain does not change without frequency and repetition. And we also have to go and deal with our awareness points. Because oftentimes there's things that are in our environment, whether it's our foods or the way that our family dynamic works, or stressors that we're exposed to, or activity levels, or whatever it might be. We need to address those as well to make sure that we're helping to create the best environment for our child to transition from struggle to success. Okay? So in the next videos, we'll start really digging into that and breaking those pieces apart so much more, so that you can get the complete picture of what you need to do to help your child. Now, if you have questions, I want you to feel free to contact us, okay? When you watch this, you can contact me at elitefamilykairos.com. You can send a message through us through the website. You can message us right through Facebook at facebook.com/elitefamilykairos. I will respond to any of those, or my staff will filter them to me so we can go through and start getting the answers. If it's just you want more information for the podcast, let me know and we'll create more content specific to your questions, because all of these things here right now that you have context, hopefully they've generated a lot of questions that need answered. So ask them and we'll start getting these things put together for you, okay? So I want you to make sure that if this video, if this podcast is something that helped you, it likely will help somebody else. So do me a favor, when you listen to this, if you have a friend or a loved one who has a child that is struggling, or maybe they're struggling themselves, send this to them. Because the more that we can get the pieces together, the more people that we can help to get solutions so the quality of life gets to where it should be. Okay? So if you have other questions, let me know. Otherwise, I will see you in the next episode. I look forward to seeing you there. This is Dr. Scott. God bless you all, and be elite. Thank you for listening to the Growing Healthy Families podcast, the world's #1 source for health education. Make sure to go to iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts and give us a review. Make sure to follow us on social media at the links listed in the show notes, and let us know what area of health you are struggling with so we can get you and your family on the road to epic health.